Welcome back, everyone, to another video, and I hope you guys all enjoyed the 4-hour live stream that we did with Mr. Beat yesterday. It was a lot of fun. I know I saw a lot of familiar faces in the chat, so I know a lot of you were there. If you haven't seen it, go ahead and check it out. You head on over to Mr. Beat's page, and you can see that. Maybe watch a little bit at a time. 4 hours is a lot in one chunk. But piggybacking off of that conversation about the United States presidents, I have been wanting to do this video since I saw it came out. And it's our friend Matt, also named Matt, just like Mr. Beat, over at Useful Charts. And he did a video in the past few days called, "Are the U.S. Presidents All Related?" And the simple answer is, for the most part, yeah. But there's nothing unique about that. We're going to get into that a little bit today, and I'll give you some background before we do. But before I mention that, in addition to my collaboration with Mr. Beat yesterday, I've got two other things coming up this week that I'm excited to share with you. One is that tomorrow night, Wednesday night, at 8 p.m. Eastern Time, I'm going to be on Instagram Live with History Chick 1944, I think is her username. But I'll share the link with you guys to that when we get a little closer. She's been doing a series of Instagram interviews, Instagram Live, where she interviews people with history YouTube channels. And I get to be number 3 in her series, so I'm excited to be able to join her for that. I think people can submit questions to her ahead of time. The other thing is Thursday night, I'm going to be doing a podcast. A teenager from Canada reached out to me with a really cool idea, and I'm going to be joining him for a podcast where I am going to present my starting 11 if I was putting together a presidential soccer team or football for the rest of the world. Who would be my starting 11 and why? So we're going to talk about that. It's blending two of my great loves, which is presidential history and a game that I have not only coached, but all three of my kids have played, and I absolutely love. So that is going to be coming up, but we're going to go ahead and dive in to this video.
Hi, this is Matt Baker. This coming Monday is President's Day in the U.S., and therefore I thought it would be a good time to address the question, are all the U.S. presidents related? You see, back in 2009, a young girl by the name of Brigianne Davigneau made the news for having discovered that every single U.S. president, except one, is the direct descendant of King John of England.
And except one, that said, here's the thing about genealogy. First of all, once you get back to a certain point, there's only certain lines that you're going to be able to get back on. Like, I've got some lines back to guys like King John, but I've got hundreds of other lines that I can't get back that far. So Martin Van Buren, the guy that they're talking about that they haven't been able to link to King John, he's the only one. It doesn't mean he doesn't have a link somewhere. We just don't know about it. And this is something I talk about over and over again. You guys hear me talk all the time about my family tree and about my famous ancestors, about my connections through my ancestors to events of the past. I am not unique in that. It's just that in 30 years of doing research on my family history, I just know a lot of that information because I've found it. I've got 35,000 names in my family history file. If you spent that much time as I have researching your family history, you would find those same exact connections. So there's nothing strange or fascinating about the fact that all U.S. presidents, for the most part, can be traced back to King John. All Americans, probably for the most part, if they have any kind of English ancestry or even any kind of European ancestry, are probably going to be able to find those lines, as are you and I. So nothing unique there.
Ever since then, whenever people come across this fact, they assume that something extraordinary must be at work.
Not at all.
Some people even start wondering about whether there really are secret societies that...
It's the Illuminati, the Rothschilds, oh my gosh. And you know, there are people who are going to believe that stuff, but again, I'll say it, nothing unique here at all.
...control the world, or ancient bloodlines that continue to hold on to power. Well, here's the thing. The answer to the question, are all the U.S. presidents related, is in fact yes.
Yep.
However, the problem is that we should actually be asking a different question.
Are they all related the same way?
What we should be asking is, are all the U.S. presidents more closely related to each other than any other random group of natural-born Americans would be?
No, and here's the thing. Most of these presidents, in fact, just about all of them, have roots that go back hundreds of years in the United States. Even, someone like Barack Obama, who on his father's side, his father was born in Africa, but on his mother's side, his roots go back all the way to the 1600s in the United States. In fact, that's one of my known connections, is I descend from a guy named Thomas Blossom. A little bit of a tangent here. A lot of people don't know that when the Mayflower came over in 1620, there were actually two ships. There was the Mayflower and the Speedwell. Speedwell was smaller, and it sprung a leak. They'd gotten hundreds of miles into the journey. It sprung a leak. They had to turn around and come back, do repairs. They left again. It was still leaking. They finally decided to load up as many people as they could from the Speedwell onto the Mayflower. That's why the Mayflower was a little more crowded than it should have been. But some people stayed behind. One of the people who stayed behind was a guy named Thomas Blossom, who was a good friend of Governor Bradford of Plymouth Colony, and there's letters that exist to this day between them. And Thomas Blossom is my 9th great-grandfather. He also happens to be a direct ancestor of both Barack Obama and President George W. Bush. So through him, I'm related to both of those guys, and they're related to each other. Again, nothing unique about that. If you have roots that go back that far in America, you're probably going to find connections to famous people.
Because the answer to that question is no. For example, 2 weeks ago on this channel, I demonstrated how Mr. Beat and I are actually 11th cousins, even though he's an American and I'm a Canadian. This is because if we go back far enough, everyone in the world is related to
Yeah, and honestly, American, Canadian, I mean, that happened a lot. My wife's great-great-grandparents were born in Canada, so it happens.
Each other, somehow. And you usually don't have to go back as far as you might think. Today's video is actually a 3-part collaboration between Genie Vlogger, Mr. Beat, and Useful Charts.
And I've had a chance to get to know all of these guys, so that's awesome. Very cool. We're all part of, there's a secret society. You might have heard me mention here and there. We're all part of this group. I just joined a few weeks ago. It was actually Matt from Useful Charts who invited me to it, where all of us history YouTubers are kind of in this group, and we kind of bounce ideas off each other and share and collaborate, and you'll be seeing more collaborations with some of these folks. I'm sure at some point I'll collaborate with all these guys, so I'm excited about that, because every one of these history YouTubers, listen, we're all on the same side. We all just want to learn, and we want to share what we've learned, and we want to help other people learn. It is not a competition. I want to see every one of these guys be incredibly successful, and I'm sure they want the same for me.
Vlogger's video, he's going to explain why it is that most of us are more closely related than you think. In Mr. Beat's video, he's going to talk about some of the US presidents who are in fact quite closely related. And in this video, well, I of course am going to show you a family tree chart, one that includes 20 US presidents. And I'm going to show you the closest connections that I could find between those 20.
Dance to the music a little bit.
Okay, I'm going to start off with Martin
He's the weirdo.
Van Buren, the 8th President of the United States.
He's the weirdo that they haven't found any connection to King John yet, but he also, I think, is the only American president who did not speak English as his first language growing up. He spoke Dutch. That whole area, New York City was originally New Amsterdam, and it was a Dutch colony there on Manhattan. It didn't last very long, but there's a lot of Dutch history there that goes up the Hudson River Valley, and you see like the Van Schack families, and even the family that Alexander Hamilton married into, the Schuyler family, and the Van Rensselaers are right there. And anytime you see that van, that's usually a dead giveaway that you're probably dealing with the Dutch.
Remember how Bridjan Davigno's chart included every president except one? Well, some people assume that that one missing person was Obama.
No, he's got white ancestors on his mom's side.
Martin Van Buren. Van Buren was the first person of Dutch descent, as opposed to British descent, to serve as president. But just because he's not a descendant of King John of England, it does not mean that he's not related to other presidents. This is because most of the later presidents have mixed ancestry, just like most Americans today.
Yeah, and the Roosevelts being from New York, a lot of New Yorkers who have roots that go back a long time in New York are going to have some Dutch ancestry there.
For example, the two Roosevelts had Dutch, British, and French ancestors. You can see here that Martin Van Buren had a third cousin who was the great-grandmother of Teddy Roosevelt.
And, you know, you hear the third cousin, first cousin, second cousin thing all the time, and people misunderstand that and sometimes use it in the wrong way. It's really, really simple, actually, to figure out. Most people know what a first cousin is. If you have a first cousin, your parents are siblings to each other. And so these two being sisters, their sons are first cousins to each other. Their grandsons or their grandchildren would be second cousins. And so my child and my first cousin's child would be second cousins. My grandchild, my first cousin's grandchild would be third cousins to each other. The removed thing comes when you have it go down a generation on one side but not the other. So the child of my first cousin is my first cousin once removed. The grandchild of my first cousin is my first cousin twice removed. That's how it works. And I had somebody get pretty angry with me a few weeks ago, commenting on a video because I made reference to having cousins who fought in the First World War, and they said that's impossible. That was 100 years ago. You don't have cousins who fought in the First World War. And I said, yes, I do. And I explained how it worked just as I explained it now. And he said, well, that's not the same. That's an American thing. That, you know, and yeah, finally I ended up having to block him because he just was not understanding reason at all. You have first cousins 3,000 years ago. They're just first cousins a whole bunch of times removed. That's just how it works. I mean, I don't make the rules.
26th U.S. president. This means that Teddy Roosevelt actually has a closer blood relationship to Van Buren than he does to Franklin Roosevelt.
Franklin's his fifth cousin.
Of course, the two Roosevelts are also related. But
and interestingly, as you see here, Eleanor Roosevelt, Franklin's wife, was born a Roosevelt. She's the niece of Theodore Roosevelt. In fact, Elliot, her father, took his own life. And so Theodore Roosevelt walked her down the aisle when she married Franklin.
Not as closely as you might think. You have to go back 6 generations to find the Roosevelt ancestor that Teddy and Franklin share in common. That man was Nicholas Roosevelt. Teddy descends from his son Johannes, whereas Franklin descends from his son Jacob. This makes the two Roosevelt presidents 5th cousins. Another thing you might not have been aware of is that Eleanor Roosevelt, the wife of Franklin Roosevelt, was also a Roosevelt.
Yep.
Not just by marriage, but by birth. She was actually Teddy Roosevelt's niece. So,
hold on a second. Hey, Matt, I know you might watch this, so I'm just going to point out, and I'm sure you've caught it by now. Teddy Roosevelt was not president from 1901 to 1919. 1919 is when he died, so easy, understandable mistake to make. I make mistakes like that all the time.
So the two presidents actually share a closer relationship through marriage than they do through blood.
1909.
Franklin Roosevelt was the 32nd president, and he is often remembered by his initials FDR. Well, the D stands for Delano, which was his mother's maiden name. The Delano family
And helpful hint in doing family tree history research, and I'm going to be doing some more videos helping you guys learn how to do your research. I get probably 3 or 4 emails a day from people asking me still if they can hire me to do family history research. Unfortunately, I just don't have the time to take on that kind of a load. I know I mentioned months ago in a video that I would do it, but I had no idea that I would get the response that I did to that, and it's just not possible. So instead, what I'm going to try to do is make some more videos giving you guys tips and hints on helping you to get started yourself, because there's a lot of great resources. When I started researching my family history back in the mid-90s, you had to go to places. Like if I wanted to look at the census, I had to drive up to Cleveland to go to Case Western Reserve University and get the microfilm of the U.S. Census and go like this and crank through the microfilm to find what I was looking for. There weren't even a good index to find it. I'd have to go through 30 pages sometimes to try and find the person I was looking for. Now you can get online and there are free sites where you can access the census just by typing things in, and it's fully indexed and everything. It's fantastic, the resources we have today that we didn't have even 15, 20 years ago. So I'll try to show you some ways to be able to take advantage of that.
Descends from a man named Philip Delano, who arrived in New England just 1 year after the Mayflower.
And here's a particular helpful hint. Spelling in genealogy means nothing at all. Names get changed constantly. A lot of generations of people, especially if they were poor farmers, may not have been able to read or write. And so when the census taker comes around, for example, hey, what's your name? Delano. Oh, Delano. Okay, and that becomes the record now. And, people's names change over time based on how it's pronounced. My last name is Mowry, Mowery, which is an English name, but my ancestors were Germans. They were Maurer, Maurer. Over the years, the records kind of changed and it became Mourer, and then Moury, and then Maury, and then eventually the spelling we have today. My great-grandparents, the last name spelled different on their tombstone than it is on mine. My great-great-grandparents, their last name was Gearhart, and one has it spelled differently than the spouse right next to them. Two stones right next to each other spelled differently. And in Kentucky, a lot of them pronounce it Gayhart. And so my distant cousin, the actress Rebecca Gayhart, is from the same Gearhart family as me, but they pronounced it different and it ended up being spelled that way. Down in Kentucky, my last name is pronounced Maury, and that was more along the lines of the Maury. So lot of things happen like that where names get changed and spelled different, and it's crazy.
And he's actually the ancestor of 3 American presidents. In addition to FDR, he's also the direct ancestor of Ulysses Grant, the 18th president, and Calvin Coolidge.
So you can see here, if we're doing the math here, we've got siblings. So we've got first cousins, second cousins, third cousins. Third cousin once removed. So Grant is a third cousin twice removed. Well, let's see. They're the same generation here. One, that's first cousin, second, third, fourth. Grant's a fourth cousin once removed to Franklin Roosevelt. So even Grant is closer related to Franklin Roosevelt than Teddy and Franklin are to each other.
30th president. So that makes FDR and Ulysses Grant fourth cousins once removed.
Take
and
a shot.
FDR and Coolidge, sixth cousins twice removed. Now, before we go on, a lot of people get confused by the whole once removed, twice removed
I didn't know he was going to talk
terminology.
about this.
So let me quickly explain. If 2 people share the same parents, they are siblings. If they both have a kid, those kids are first cousins.
And technically speaking, if you have half siblings, they're half first cousins. And if you have siblings who marry each other, so let's say that me and my sister marries a guy and I marry that guy's sister, our children become what are known as double first cousins because they actually share twice as much DNA as normal first cousins would because they have the same set of 4 grandparents as each other.
The next generation down would be second cousins, and then third cousins, and so on. However, when we're comparing the relationship between 2 people in different generations, we use the term removed to refer to how big the difference is. So, for example, if we want to describe the relationship between this person and this person, we'd say that they are first cousins once removed.
Yep.
If you kept going down, you'd get twice removed, 3 times removed,
Yep.
and so forth. Okay, so back to the presidents. You can see here that FDR had a great-great-grandmother named Elizabeth Cushman, and she was the direct descendant of Isaac Allerton, one of the 51 surviving passengers of the Mayflower. The Mayflower...
And literally millions of people are descended from this tiny group of Mayflower passengers. My line goes back to a guy who was actually a indentured servant to the Winslow family. His name was George Soule.
Being the first English boat to arrive in what would become New England. That was way back in the year 1620. Several U.S. presidents are Mayflower descendants, as are many Americans in general.
Yep.
For example, Zachary Taylor was also a descendant of Isaac Allerton, whereas the 2 Bushes descend from Mayflower passenger John Howland. FDR actually descends from a second Mayflower passenger, Richard Warren, as did Ulysses Grant. And Coolidge and the 2 Adams descend from Mayflower passenger John Alden.
And again, everybody with roots in America that go back long enough has these kinds of connections. There's nothing unique or special about this.
Speaking of the Bushes and the Adams, these are the only two cases of father-son presidents. John Adams, who was president just after George Washington, was one of the 56 men who signed the Declaration of Independence. At the time he signed it, his son, John Quincy Adams, was only 8 years old.
But John Quincy might be one of the most qualified people who's ever been president. Just had a ridiculous resume. And incidentally, too, out of the first 7 presidents, they're the only 2 that didn't get 2 terms. The other ones did. Washington, Jefferson, Monroe, Madison, and Andrew Jackson.
But several decades later, John Quincy would go on to serve as the country's 6th president. The Bushes, of course, both served as president much more recently. George H.W. Bush being the 41st president, and his son George W. Bush being the 43rd. In addition to the 2 sets of father-son presidents, there was also a case of grandfather-grandson presidents. That was William Harrison, the 9th president, and Benjamin Harrison, the 23rd president.
And Benjamin Harrison V, who is William Henry Harrison's father, was a signer of the Declaration of Independence. So long history there as well. John Scott Harrison, the guy who happens to be the son of one president and the father of another, was a congressman with a really fascinating story after his death, and some of you may have heard me refer to it before. He was the victim of body snatchers who stole his body, and body snatching was a common thing at a time in history where medical schools were trying really hard to get their hands on cadavers, and there was no easy way to do that. Sometimes people would steal bodies and sell them to medical schools. And John Scott Harrison, I believe, was found by his son Benjamin Harrison hanging on a meat hook. Not the way you want to see your dad after he's already been dead. But that was kind of a thing that happened.
William Harrison is notable in that he died a mere 31 days after his inauguration, making his presidency the shortest of all time.
And there's been some recent scholarship done and investigations into some of the reasons why that may have happened. And, the traditional thing is he gave the longest inaugural address in history at that point and didn't cover up properly, got sick, and died. But a lot of people are speculating that there was a real issue with the water supply to the White House that was regularly making people sick and killing people. That William Henry Harrison may have been a victim of that. Zachary Taylor was almost certainly a victim of it. And even going down to the Lincoln administration, President Lincoln's son Willie, who died in February of 1862, may have been a victim of that.
Let's now look at James Madison, the 4th president, James Polk, the 11th president, and Zachary Taylor, the 12th.
Yeah, the Taylor family is one of those ones that, just related to a bunch of presidents.
Other than the presidents who share a last name, these 3 are the most closely related. This is because they all descend from this man here, James Taylor Jr. This makes Taylor and Madison second cousins, and Polk their second cousin once removed.
Look at that. I mean, think about it if you're this dude, right? James Taylor Jr. You have a great-grandson who becomes president, and two great-grandsons who became president, and a great-great-grandson who became president. That's impressive stuff right there. And if you go back to his father, now you're talking about 2 great-great-grandsons, a 3rd great-grandson, and then also another descendant who's a president. And then you go back one more generation and you add Abraham Lincoln to the mix. It's crazy.
I'd also like to point out that Taylor's daughter, Sarah, was the first wife of Jefferson Davis, who, after Sarah's death, went on to serve as the first and only president of the Confederate States of America.
Yeah, she died pretty early on in their marriage, and then he married Verena Howe. And Zachary Taylor's son, Richard Taylor, was a lieutenant general in the Confederate Army.
The group of breakaway states in the South that ended up losing the Civil War. The Taylor family also connects to 2 additional presidents. James Taylor Jr. had a brother named John. If we follow his line 6 generations down, we come to First Lady Claudia Taylor, better known as Lady Bird Johnson, wife of the 36th president, Lyndon B. Johnson. But the Taylors also have a connection to one of the most famous presidents of all time, Abraham Lincoln, the 16th president. If we go up 2 generations from James Taylor Jr., we get to the family patriarch, John Taylor, who was one of the earliest settlers in Virginia. If we follow his son Thomas's line down 6 generations, we come to Nancy Hanks,
who did not die as the result of a vampire attack, despite what you may have seen in the movie, and is from the same Hanks family that actor Tom Hanks is a part of. So he is a distant relative of Abraham Lincoln, who, by the way, Abraham Lincoln has no living descendants at this point. He had 4 sons, Edward Baker Lincoln, who died young, I think in the 1850s, Willie, who died in the White House, Tad, who died a few years after his father, and only his son, Robert Todd Lincoln, survived into adulthood. And Robert, I think his family only went as far as his grandchildren and then died out.
The mother of Abraham Lincoln. So that's Lincoln's maternal side. On his father's side, Abraham Lincoln is related to the Harrisons. You can see here that the Harrison family starts with 2 brothers.
Yeah, and Abraham Lincoln's roots do go back to Virginia. I think his grandfather, who was also named Abraham, was from Virginia.
And Benjamin, both of whom were, like John Taylor, early settlers in Virginia. Lincoln descends from Thomas, whereas the 2 Harrison presidents descend from Benjamin. I'd also like to point out William Harrison's father, Benjamin Harris V. He too is an important figure in U.S. history, being that he was one of the signers of the Declaration of Independence, and hence a founding father. Yep. His mother was Anne Carter, and through her, the Harrisons are connected to 2 more famous Virginia families.
And I think Robert E. Lee's got a connection there with the Carter family as well.
The Carters and the Washingtons. Anne Carter and Jimmy Carter are in fact related, but the connection is pretty distant, so I haven't shown it on the chart. Instead, I've shown her connection to the Washingtons. Anne Carter's great-great-grandmother was Anne Washington, the sister of Lawrence Washington. Both Anne Washington's daughter Phyllis and Lawrence Washington's son John immigrated to Virginia. John was the great-grandfather of the very first president of the United States, George Washington.
Who, though he's the father of our country, had no biological children. He did have, adopted his wife, Martha, was previously married, and she had 2 children from that marriage, a son and a daughter. The daughter died like in her early teens, practically, I think, in George Washington's arms. And then the son, Jack, he was known as Jackie, actually accompanied his stepfather during the Revolutionary War and died when they were at Yorktown, not as a result of combat, but because of illness. And Jack's son, George Washington Parke Custis, was the father of Robert E. Lee's wife, and built the Custis, what's known as the Custis Lee Mansion, Arlington. And I'll actually get into their history a little more when I start releasing my videos from Arlington National Cemetery.
Okay, there's a few more connections I want to show you. Earlier, I mentioned Lyndon Johnson. Well, Lyndon Johnson is actually Obama's closest presidential relative. Both of them descend from a Revolutionary soldier named Philip Ament, making them 4th cousins 3 times removed.
Pretty close.
Finally, there's Richard Nixon. He descends from Henry Howland, the brother of Mayflower passenger John Howland. But the president he's most connected to is actually by marriage, not...
Yeah, and Eisenhower was president when Nixon was vice president in the 1950s. And, how cool is this, that Julie Nixon and David Eisenhower's kids, your grandpa is Richard Nixon and your great-grandpa is Dwight Eisenhower. I mean, that's pretty crazy to be that closely related to 2 presidents.
Not by blood. In 1968, just after he was elected the 37th president, his daughter Julie married David Eisenhower, the grandson of the 34th president, Dwight Eisenhower. Ever hear of a place called Camp David? It's a retreat near Washington that U.S. presidents have been using since the 1930s. Well, it received its current name from President Eisenhower, who in 1953 decided to change the name to Camp David to honor both his father and his grandson.
And Dwight Eisenhower was actually born David Dwight Eisenhower, but when he was very, very young, his parents changed it to Dwight David Eisenhower.
Both of whom were named David. At the time, the younger David was only 5 years old. Okay, so that was a look at some of the closest genealogical connections between U.S. presidents. If you think there's something that I missed, be sure to tell me in the comments.
So thank you, Matt, for that. I think that was really good. I enjoyed that a lot. I love all the useful chart stuff because it combines my love of history and my love of genealogy, which is a huge passion of mine. Those are probably my two greatest passions in terms of my interest, genealogy and history. So definitely we'll be sharing more with you down the road. If you want to check out this video without my commentary or anything else from Useful Charts, check their channel out. The last Useful Charts video I did, that day they went over 1 million subscribers, so I was pretty excited to maybe add a few more subscribers in their direction. Well earned, so definitely check them out and subscribe if you haven't already. We'll be back tomorrow with another video. Thanks for watching.